4th of July, all sorts of good things. But what was striking to me was that none of these holidays that we celebrated here at First Nations had anything to do with who we are and what our mission is at First Nations. It really wasn't holding up those Native leaders that we, most of the staff, know and admire. And so I thought, as the second president of First Nations, that we should have a holiday that honors one of our own. And for me, there was lots of choices, right? I mean, it could be Sitting Bull or Chief Joseph or Woman Man Killer. I mean, the list goes on and on of famous Native folks. But I think even for Natives, there's still a certain naivete or misunderstanding about the history and the politics and the leadership among Alaska Native communities. And so I decided that if I'm going to kick off having an Indian specific holiday at First Nations, since I was president, I get to choose. I chose to have a Tlingit honored. And for me, it was even easier than that. As I'm sure most of you have read a bit about Elizabeth Peratrovich, and what she has done for Alaska Native communities and Native communities in general. For me, it's a family story as well. My great grandmother was Rosanna Peratrovich, and she was the sister of Roy Peratrovich and Bob Peratrovich and a couple of other Peratoviches. But why that's important is for me for a couple of things. One is my Tlingit name Techsane I was given that name. That was Bob Peratovich's name, and Bob Peratovich, that family was very prominent in Owak, Alaska, which is on Prince of Wales Island. Bob opened a cannery there, brought potable water to the town, brought electricity to town. He really was an entrepreneur and innovator and a change maker in the Owak community. But he and his brother Roy were also very involved in the Alaska Native Brotherhood. And the Alaska Native Brotherhood and Alaska Native Sisterhood were very important in Alaska because they were the two groups in primarily in Southeast Alaska, who were advocating for Native rights, mostly Indigenous land rights, taking the U.S. government to task about the Alaska Natives never extinguishing their Indigenous rights to the land resources of Alaska. For folks who don't know much about Alaska Native Brotherhood and Alaska Native Sisterhood, there's this great book out there by Peter Metcalf. It's called A Dangerous Idea. It's a very short book, about a couple hundred pages, but really highlights some of the work that Natives all over Alaska were doing in a fairly well-coordinated effort to bring about Indigenous rights in Alaska. Because as you might suspect, Indigenous rights in Alaska didn't look much different than Indigenous rights throughout the rest of the United States. The United States had the audacity to purchase Alaska. I'm not sure that they purchased it from another colonial power, Russia. But I'm not sure. It was pretty clear to us Tlinkits and Haidas and Tsimshians and Aleuts and Athabascans that the Russians didn't have ownership to sell. And so we had lots of rights we think we had retained and not extinguished. And, because of the way that colonial powers work, the brown folks who started in Alaska were disempowered upon settlement by Russia and by sale to the United States. And so, Alaska Native Brotherhood and Sisterhood was very instrumental in fighting for those rights. And Bob and Rosanna, brother was Roy Peratrovich Sr. And he must have been a pretty amazing guy because he got Elizabeth Peratrovich to marry him. And as a guy who finds myself lucky to have found a wife who's willing to put up with myself on a regular basis, I understand that is a pretty challenging thing to do. But they together were a pretty powerful force. They lived in Kloak for a very long time and decided to move to Juneau just to be closer to the legislature. And in many ways, a lot of folks who lived in Alaska Native villages moved from those villages to more economic and social centers because they didn't want their kids going to boarding schools. That at that point in time, kids that were in Kloak were being sent all the way down to Chemawa, Oregon for boarding school. My grandfather, who was a generation behind Roy and Elizabeth, took a boat to Ketchikan and another steamship to Seattle and then a train down to Chemawa, Oregon with just him and his 13-year-old sister to go to boarding school. So this is what, folks were trying to change about their lives. And that was one of the reasons that Roy and Elizabeth moved to Juneau, was to have, in some ways a better life for their children, but also because they were very active politically in ANB-ANS, Alaska Native Brotherhood and Alaska Native Sisterhood. And they knew that the levers of power in Alaska were in Juneau and thought that they could affect change by being sitting next to the legislature. So that's how I'm related to Elizabeth Peratrovich, not by blood, but by marriage. But, for me growing up, I didn't hear this story until almost out of high school. Even, for kids growing up in Alaska in the 1970s and 80s, Alaska Native history wasn't part of our curriculum. And I don't remember how this came up. I think it was a conversation when I was playing pinochle with my grandfather, where he said, "Oh, you should be really proud that you come from Peratoviches, and this is why." And that was kind of the first time I had ever been exposed to my own history, my own family's really pretty amazing lobbying on the part of Native Alaskans. And for those of you who haven't watched the movie about Elizabeth Peratrovich, I think it's just very powerful because it really tells a story not just about her, though she is the center of that story. It really talks about the widespread discrimination in Alaska at the time. Even in my dad's time growing up, which is the 1960s, there were still signs in the windows, no dogs or Indians allowed, and there were restaurants and businesses that wouldn't serve Native customers. As you saw in that movie, there was certain seats reserved for Native people in movie theaters. It was pretty widespread. I mean, it didn't look much different than the Jim Crow South. And I think we forget that discrimination in the United States wasn't just black and white. But we forget that it's not just binary. And I think that when we have those conversations as a society, we forget that discrimination is pretty widespread. And there are some folks like Natives, oftentimes Asians and Pacific Islanders, who get left out of the conversation. And so I think it's, for me, it's really important to highlight that. It's been a really important part of my life, and what I share with my daughters. Excuse me. For those of you who don't know, I have two daughters, and they both have middle names that are derived from Elizabeth. My oldest is Evan Elise, which is short for Elizabeth. And then feeling awfully guilty that I gave my oldest daughter the derivation of Elizabeth Peratrovich as a middle name. We named my youngest daughter Lauren Elizabeth. So they both have claim on being descendants of Elizabeth Peratrovich. But it's really important for them to understand that it wasn't just Alaska Natives sticking up for themselves and for the rights of people, but also that this was an Alaska Native woman right? And we talk about male leaders a lot in Indian country, but we're not as good, or we haven't been as good historically about talking about women leaders. I think it's changed a little bit in recent years with Deb Haaland, with people like the senator out of representative out of Kansas, Sharice Davis, and the new congressman out of Alaska. And even maybe a little bit back further, like Wilma Mankiller. But, there are so many amazing Native women leaders. And for me as a father of daughters, that was really important for my daughters to understand, where they came from, who they're named for, and just this remarkable lady who, beyond people's expectations of her, really stood up for not just herself, not just her tribe, but for Native people in Alaska and everywhere, in a time when that wasn't socially acceptable, at a time when civil rights in the lower 48 was maybe being talked about and maybe being organized. But, she was able to affect legislation 20 years before the Civil Rights Act that got passed in the lower 48. So to me, when we were looking at a holiday to create at First Nations, this is a pretty stinking easy one to make. And so, just thrilled that you guys are all interested in this amazing woman. I'd encourage you to, read more about her, read more about the Alaska Native Brotherhood and Sisterhood, and some of the Indigenous rights work that's going on today in Alaska. I mean, it's just in the last few years when people are litigating voting rights cases, our good friends at NARF have repeated, that's Native Americans Rights Funds, have repeatedly had to litigate against the state of Alaska for the inclusion of Native language ballots, which is which is U.S. law, and actually Alaska law, that they include these things, but that yet they still have to litigate these things again and again. So the civil rights abuses, discrimination that happened in Alaska, almost 100 years ago, is still happening today. And so that's why I think it's really important that we highlight Elizabeth and her work and her words, and just excited to be a relative by marriage, and really excited that I think we're the only organization outside of Alaska that honors her day. And I shock my Tlingit and Haida colleagues every year when I point that out to them, that they could be doing this in their organizations in other places besides Longmont, Colorado. So not to chat too much, because I could go on and on about some of this work, but I just love to open this up for discussion. If folks are curious about Alaska in the 1960s and 70s, I could probably give a little bit more insight, but just love to have a conversation about Native rights, Alaska Native rights, this constant conversation we have about invisibility as Native people in general, and probably even more so as Alaska Native people. But whatever people want to talk about, I love talking about this stuff.
Yes, and you can put your questions in the chat. I'll watch for them. And yes, please ask your questions. I didn't even know about Elizabeth Peratrovich until I got a job with First Nations, and I feel so lucky to know who she is now, because I did a lot of research, and I bought her book, which is sorry, I have my thing on blur, but it's Fighter in Velvet Gloves, and I'll pop that in the chat. And there's a great lecture by the woman who wrote the book on YouTube, which is part of the resources that we'll be sending out. But yeah, it's thank you, Mike. And questions from anybody? I don't see any raised hands.
raised hand. Where is it?
You can just do it physically too if you need to. You don't have to find the electronic one.
I'll be happy. I'll be happy to start. Thank you for this. I was wondering, picking up on what you mentioned a moment ago, whether Congresswoman Peltola's election signals a significant political change in the status of Native communities in Alaska in terms of their relations with non-Native communities, and also focusing on environmental versus development, whether the tension between different tribal communities in Alaska has a path towards resolution, or are there just some folks who are going to be unalterably in favor of continued mineral extraction and others opposed?
Yeah. So the first part of your question about Congresswoman Peralta, I don't know. I'm pretty excited about it. One is because it's been, the Alaska Native population is probably the largest population by percentage of any state in the union. And I've always, in growing up in Alaska, I was always frustrated that we couldn't have been a more political force in the state if unified, right? And there's some studies out there that talk about, Native participation in the democratic process at large, and you'll know when you read through some of this stuff that Indians don't vote at the same rate as non-native, say a much lower rate. What's really interesting when you look at some of these studies is that when natives believe that their vote counts, meaning tribal and local corporate elections, they vote at a much higher rate than their non-native counterparts do in general elections. And so, when folks actually believe they have a voice, they show up at the polls. And I think that when we see, Senator Murkowski's election a few years ago for the write-in campaign, part of the galvanizing force between her reelection was the native vote. And I think we saw that with Congresswoman Peralta as well, is that for the first time, not the first time, but you saw in these last couple of elections a native vote that was much more homogeneous behind a candidate than you'd seen in the past, which always gives me hope, right? Again, when you see Alaska Natives with such a large population base, and the goal of many political forces in Alaska is to pit these organizations and these tribes against each other. I mean, Alaska is not a big state, right? About 1 million people, 220 tribes and villages. If you think about how many tribes and villages there are total in the United States that are recognized by the U.S. government, it's about 750, maybe a little bit less. And so, Alaska Native tribes at 220 make up a big number of the tribes. And as you might imagine, there are regional differences. Alaska, besides, even though it's heavily misrepresented on maps, is about a quarter of the U.S. land base, right? The tip of Alaska, if you superimposed it on a lower 48 map, tip of Alaska up near Barrow and stuff would be up in the Minnesota area with the southeast chain hitting the Keys in Florida. And so, these geographic and ethnic and cultural differences are pretty pronounced at times, right? That's like saying the Seminole of Florida and the Red Lake Band of Chippewa up in Michigan are similar, and they're not, right? And so Alaska, has those same sort of differences. And Alaska is and they call it the last frontier for a reason. You have a mentality up there that is very civil libertarian, very small government, high resource extraction. A lot of the economic engines of Alaska are resource extraction, whether that's timber or minerals or fish or whatever. And so you do have different groups in Alaska who have different economic reasons for wanting different sorts of economic activity. You know, the high rates of unemployment for Alaska Natives for a whole bunch of reasons. Mostly they don't control the levers of power. And so there's a lot of discrimination for higher paid jobs. And so, you know, the governments and leaders in Alaska, even in Alaska Native villages and corporations, have to find ways to keep their people fed, keep their people employed, keep their people healthy. And you see them making decisions like you see tribal leaders in the lower 48 having to make tough choices about what that means. And sometimes that means resource extraction and you know, what can be happen in one part of the state and really pit folks against each other in other parts of the state. I do see that there are opportunities where that's lessening in Alaska. I think the unification by Native folks pretty much at large against the Pebble mine that was slated to be permitted and then would have probably poisoned the largest sockeye salmon run in the world had it been allowed. That was, you know, highly lobbied against, not just by the tribes in Southeast and South Central Alaska, but tribes throughout Alaska. So I think you're seeing a lot more tribes, you know, rallying against resource extraction in Alaska. I know that the Tlingit tribe, the tribal corporation I belong to, Sea Alaska, actually stopped its logging operations about 4 years ago and has been selling its carbon credits for its forest and is making almost as much selling its carbon credits as it was taking logs out of the forest. So I think that, you know, tribes have always been good stewards of the land, and when they can align their economic incentives with their natural incentives for as caretakers, it works really well. It's just that hasn't happened as often as I think we would like for other reasons. So I think that there'll always be these conflicts because you have regional and cultural differences, but I think that you're seeing more and more, not unification, but collaboration between tribes and villages in Alaska. And that's a very long answer to a very short question, so I apologize. Did you have another part of your question that I missed? I can't remember. I just got caught on my soapbox.
We have a raised hand.
Hi, Marissa. Yeah, that's me. Hi, everyone. This is Gina. And thank you, Marissa and Mike, for putting this together for us. I am in Florida, and some of you may know about the challenges the African-American population here in Florida is dealing with right now vis-a-vis the public education system, with our governor blocking certain courses that are focused on African-American history. So I'm just curious where things stand in Alaska with regard to Native Alaskan education in history being taught within your public education system.
Yeah, you know what? I can tell you, I don't have an answer because I'm not that familiar with where they are. At one point in time, we tracked which states had requirements for inclusion, Native history inclusion in their curriculum. I think Alaska is one of them. I'm pretty sure it is. I would have to check that because I might just be talking out my ass like I do often. But you know, I know that there are some alternative curriculums that are being allowed to be taught in conjunction. I know that the Tlingit and Haida tribes of Southeast, in collaboration with Sea Alaska Corporation, have created a math and science curriculum that they teach alongside traditional curriculum as a way of teaching math and science with Native stories and Native lessons. And because it's so culturally centered, it's become very effective in teaching young kids about math and science. Again, when you talk about a culture that's, in forests and next to water, the opportunities to teach about botany and biology and all those kinds of things is enormous. And the curriculum reflects that in Southeast.
Mike, Catherine wanted you to talk about your experience in the 60s and 70s or some of the things that were going on.
Yeah, I mean, it was, I shared this story a lot. One of the reasons when I went to college at 18 and never returned to Alaska is because in my mind it was pretty clear to me that there weren't a lot of opportunities for brown folks to hold positions of power, right? When I was 18 and getting ready to leave high school, I still had high school counselors talking to me about grade school, not college, as if that was the only thing that I could do. And this is just kind of, it's kind of par for the course, right? The way I don't know if I shared this much with folks, but the way my family got to Ketchikan, Alaska is my grandfather's family was from Klawock, which is on Prince of Wales Island. I think it's it's one of the largest islands in the world, but there's about 2 or 3 Tlingit and Haida villages on the island. My grandparents had both been sent to boarding school. My grandfather had been at 13 taken to Chemawa in Oregon. And then my dad had a brother and a sister, both older, who were sent to Mount Edgecombe in Sitka, Alaska to boarding school. So by the time my dad got to be in high school, my grandparents said enough, right? That they were tired of sending their kids away to boarding school, not seeing them for 9 to 12 months at a time, having them come back ashamed of who they were and their language and their culture, and all they wanted to do was not be native, right? And so my grandparents made a pretty big sacrifice. They gave up home and livelihood, living in Klawock, and moved to Ketchikan, Alaska, so my dad could go to high school at Ketchikan High School and come home every day. And I have 2 daughters. They're both in college now, so I understand kids being away and not seeing them. I don't think I understood that until this last year or 2, but the idea of having your kids taken from you at 13 or 14 and you don't see them for a year or 4 years of high school must have been pretty dramatic. And so in some ways that wasn't a big sacrifice for my grandparents to make, to hold their family together. But what they experienced when they got to Ketchikan was an economy that was highly extractive timber, fish, some mineral extraction, but it was all controlled by non-natives. And so the jobs that were available to native folks were pretty unskilled labor kinds of job, working in canneries, working in lower level non-supervisory positions at the local mills, jobs like janitors, construction workers. Really it wasn't, a chance where you could build assets, build wealth, build influence. That didn't change a whole lot between when my father moved to Ketchikan in the late 1950s, mid to late 1950s. And when I graduated in 1980, it was pretty clear from where we lived in a neighborhood that there were 3 streets, Dearmont Street, Park Avenue, and Woodland, that kind of formed this triangle. But almost everybody on those 3 streets were I always say they were aspiring middle-class native folks, right? They were almost all native. I had a paper route that had those 3 streets, and my brother and I sat in a hotel room one night and kind of walked through our paper routes, and we could tell you every name on those paper routes. And there was maybe one non-native family in those routes. It was all natives from Klawock and from Heidelberg and from Craig and from Angoon and Metlakatla, who had moved to Ketchikan for many of the same reasons my grandparents had moved there for. They were all trying to do something that was a little bit more economically beneficial for their families, and buy houses and raise kids. And so while I didn't grow up in a traditional native village, I grew up in this very, very non-traditional, but very traditional feeling native village, in that we had, lots of different tribes and lots of different villages represented, but the behavior was the same. That walking through my neighborhood as a kid, I knew that my misbehavior would be reported and stopped by 14 different aunties on my street, right? So it was and everybody I knew in Ketchikan along the 3 streets I lived in or played in all had old refrigerators that were converted into smokehouses in their backyard for smoking salmon. It was only when I got to my freshman year of college in Idaho that I realized that not everybody had a smokehouse in their backyard growing up. I was a little bit shocked to find that out, because I didn't know what they did for salmon in the wintertime when they didn't have a smokehouse in their backyard. But it was one of those really highly complex social fabric communities where poverty was present, but you weren't always aware of it, because there were non-monetary ways that communities take care of each other. People babysat, people helped each other fixing nets and cars and helping repair houses and whatnot. I think we saw similar kinds of things during Hurricane Katrina, when the 9th Ward got wiped out. These people who lived in the 9th Ward didn't recognize that they were poor until they were displaced from a neighborhood where they had all these other social fabric amenities that kept them from being impoverished, or recognized they were impoverished. And I think that's how I grew up, and there was a highly discriminatory place to live in Ketchikan. The local elementary school I went to was almost all kids from my neighborhood and from the traditional Tlingit village south of us in Saxman, Alaska. So there was, it was clearly, of the 3 elementary schools, the Brown Indian school, and the resources and the quality of teachers reflected that. I know when I got to junior high and high school, had it not been for my parents and grandparents, I would have been way behind in my education and the curriculum I was exposed to. And so, of course, people had low expectations for Indian kids, because they had not given resources to Indian kids. Again, I wish it was just my imagination. But the fact was, most of the kids I knew and still associate with from Ketchikan, most of the Indian kids who had any sort of talent moved, because they recognized that they weren't going to be given those kinds of breaks, right? Not only from an educational point of view, but there wasn't a 3-strike rule for Indian kids. It was 1 strike and you're in the juvenile detention center, or you turned 18, it was in the local jail. So it was a highly prejudiced place, highly segregated. South of Ketchikan Creek, where all the brown folks lived. And I include brown folks like all the Japanese and Filipino folks who came to Ketchikan to work in the canneries, and most of the native folks. And north of the creek were all the Scandinavian settlers who owned the wealth and power of the community. And so it wasn't always overt, but it was always present.
Well, thank you for that. Do we have any more questions? Comments? Don't be shy. Susanna, did you want to talk?
Yeah, I did actually. I made a lot of comments while Mike was talking. Sorry, I normally don't do that much chatting on the side. But I was curious to see if like Alaska's such an interesting place because most of us who haven't had the the honor of being on that land and being in relationship with that land, it's like the same like for folks in Hawaii and in Puerto Rico, right? And when we do interact with folks there or we hear of it, it's from I told people when I was in Puerto Rico for the first time last year that everything I knew about Puerto Rico is just from books, right? Until I actually had the opportunity to see there. So I'm wondering if there's a way, to bring a delegation to and from. I know that we're still, we're not even post-pandemic yet, but that is what I do a lot of work with Indigenous people. So that was what I was planning to do, is just try to organize, and not so much trade missions, but they could be so that people can get to know each other and have elders kind of move around more deliberately so that we can create gatherings more readily intergenerationally, so that our youth have the opportunity to talk with our elders while they're still alive, rather than read about them or learn about them after they transition. So that's just some of the thoughts that I've been having listening to your comments.
Yeah, no, at First Nations, we're very mindful of some of that work. We have a Native Youth and Culture program where we make grants to the funder who originally funded that. Her comment when she first funded it was that she wanted to help Indian kids feel comfortable inside their brown skins, which I thought was just a lovely, simple idea, right? And to her, that meant language and culture and tradition and things like regalia and lifestyle and learning about food ways and life ways kinds of things, right? And she said, you guys figure out how to create program around that. And what we found oftentimes when we were making grants in that program was that when we could bring youth and elders together, there was this crazy love affair that happened. And it took us a while to figure out like why wasn't this happening naturally? And because of boarding school and all sorts of other funky stuff that happens in reservation and Native communities, these folks weren't in community together oftentimes. And part of that was, economic, families had jobs and, they were busy and they had moved away from grandparents or whatever, and maybe not been ensconced in, their traditional family lifestyle. But there was also a feeling among Native youth that their elders had all this knowledge, this traditional knowledge, and they were being stingy and not sharing it. And when you talk to the elders, they were like, oh, none of these kids give a darn about culture and tradition and language. And, like why we don't have time for them because they don't want to know. And when they found each other and they realized that the kids wanted to know and the elders wanted to be generous, almost all of our really successful programs, our Native Youth Culture program, happened when we put those folks together. And so that, that's kind of on the elder youth part. On the isolation part, and I think this happens a lot in Native communities in general that we work with, especially in reservation communities, you have low resource communities who don't have a chance to be out and about with their peers. And I say their peers because someone working on language in Prince of Wales, Alaska, may not know the people in Arkansas or Montana who are doing similar kinds of things and going through similar kinds of struggles trying to create Native programming for youth. And so when, at First Nations, one of the things we're very deliberate about in our grant making program is that every other year we have this big thing called the LEAD conference, where we bring all of our grantees together. We bring our language grantees and our art grantees and our community development financial institution grantees. I mean, no matter what they're working on, we bring them together, and we have some programming that's specific to that discipline of folks we brought together. But mostly we bring all these folks together because we know the people who might be creating the CDFI in their local community are probably the social entrepreneurs who are on the school board and part of the language program. And we also recognize that while we can help folks with technical assistance and training, the best technical assistance and training they can get is from their peers. And again, our goal is to bridge that isolation of one community to the next and create a larger network of our grantee communities and Native communities in general, to know about each other, to be in community with one another, to learn from one another. And I think it's one of the most magical things we get to do at First Nations, is really kind of break down some of that isolation. I'll have to say this, as much as I'm not a big fan of Zoom sometimes and internet others, I think that these tools have been incredible for Native communities to be in contact with one another and have alleviated some of that isolation. And Alaska is a long ways away, and the funding community hasn't found Alaska very well. And so we have found that the groups that we fund from Alaska love coming to our conferences for lots of reasons. For one, they like to go shopping outside of Alaska, but they also like to know what other folks are doing. Because they have, what's really interesting about Alaska, because it's so isolated, I think there are more Native nonprofits per capita in Alaska than there are in any other Native community across the US. And they just, because they don't have access to other national nonprofit organizations that are doing work in Native communities, they just create their own. And so it's a pretty robust community. Fortunately, there's a lot without a lot of funding, but that, hopefully if we do our jobs, we can take care of some of that. But the isolation, I think is lessening, though I still think it's a big deal. The pandemic really didn't help that at all. But I do think that tools like this, like Zoom, are that we're now so accustomed to after 2 or 3 years, is making a huge difference.
There's a question in the chat that says, how do you navigate conversations with your kids in college now about identity?
Oh, I'll say it's one of the toughest conversations I have, right? I grew up in Alaska. I had a Native community around me. I had my grandparents around me. I live in Colorado. If there are a couple dozen Tlinkits in the state, I'd be surprised, honestly. And so raising my kids away from their community, and I say their community because I still think it's their community back in Alaska, has been tough. That I am, for the most part, their sole source of information about their culture, or one of their few sources of information about their culture. Is an interesting dilemma. I work for a national Native organization. My kids are probably more familiar with the pan-Indian identity than they are of their own Alaska Native identity. And they both have had to navigate that in their own ways. My oldest has been very active in trying to figure out how she fits. She's been the president of the Native Society at her school a couple of times now, and really, it made very deliberate moves to take internships with my Alaska Native Corporation. She's taking online language classes, language classes, and has rated my library about Tlingit stories and culture pretty much. My younger daughter has had a little bit more difficult time. Part of it is she's blonde-haired and blue-eyed like her mom, and so she has, she doesn't think she looks Native sometimes, and also people who know her don't think she looks Native sometimes. And I'm not sure what native is supposed to look like, right? I mean, I think we all have stereotypical ideas of what an Indian is supposed to look like. And I think that, my daughter has, had to suffer some of that as well from her peers and herself about what am I supposed to look like as a native. Again, she is taking online classes. I think one of the greatest things that we've done for my daughters is we've helped them create their own regalia. I think it's have a traditional button blanket that they dress and dance in. And we've been very deliberate about helping the girls make their own so that they had both ownership of the craft of regalia making and understanding the meaning of what they're making and how that helps them fit. And so it's an ever or ongoing, quest on both their part and my part to help them feel like they belong.
Thank you so much. We got 3 minutes. Does anybody have a quick question that we can ask?
I saw Catherine had a question.
Yeah, can you tell us about something exciting that First Nations is doing in Alaska?
Oh. So First Nations through our food program, Ade Briones, folks have met her or been watching her on our website, heads up our Native American Food Systems Initiative. One of her passions is first food. So breastfeeding, early childhood and mother connectivity. It's really resonated in Alaska for a bunch of reasons. One is this big supply chain shock of infant formula over the last year and a half, 2 years. Supply chains are pretty bad in Indian communities in general. They're horrible when you're trying to get supplies to rural villages in Alaska. So that infant formula supply shock has hit Alaska in pretty bad ways. But there are some pretty amazing coalitions of Native mothers in villages in Alaska who are not only, doing more to encourage midwifery and other birthing practices, traditional birthing practices in Alaska, but the whole idea behind First Foods has been a big part of their work that we've been able to support through this First Foods program. And it makes so much sense when you don't have a reliable supply of things like infant formula that you shouldn't be highly reliant on those in the beginning to begin with, because of the bonding that happens and the long-term autoimmune health of Indian kids and the early nutrition benefits of first food and breastfeeding. So Alaska's been like one of the places that has really, embraced our grant making program around that, and really are some of the leaders in some of the first food movement in the United States for Native communities. So I'm excited about that we've been able to be a participant in that, with limited funds that we have. But it just makes so much sense in communities like Alaska Native villages in Alaska. Yeah.
Well,
We also were able to help fund some of the frontline folks who are protesting the Pebble mine. So we were very excited that we had some funding to support some of those frontline workers there. I'll just mention one more thing, and because I see Mickey Sager is on the line, and First Nations is trying to figure out how to help Native communities access or rethink conservation tools that are used by the conservation community. And we know that private landowners are able to monetize their conservation efforts. Alaska or Indian private landholders aren't able to monetize their conservation work. So we're trying to help tribes rethink the ways in which they can do that. There's some communities in Alaska who are very interested in looking at conservation easements, if they can make them make sense and play nice with tribal jurisdiction and tribal sovereignty. And so we have this pilot project that we're trying to make conservation tools tribal sovereign friendly. And there's some communities in Alaska who are very, very interested. And Mickey's going to help us out. He's already said yes.
Thank you so much, Mike. This was really amazing. And thank you all for sharing our space today to celebrate Elizabeth Peratrovich and just natives in general. We appreciate you all for being here, and we look forward to other discussions in the future with you all. If you have any questions, you can email me or Jonna. We can put those in the chat right now, or Mike.
Yeah, I just want to say, I'll just say one more thing. I mean, I always like to leave people. I like to read. I mean, I would say, like, find the Peter Metcalf book, read the Peter Metcalf book. Awesome. Again, there's so few Southeast Alaskan native writers. There's a lady named Ernestine Hayes, and I'll get this information to Marisa to send out to you guys. But lady named Ernestine Hayes, she's written 2 books. One is called The Tao of Raven, and one is called Blonde Indian. But she's a Tlingit author. She's a teacher at University of Alaska Southeast. But is one of the few authors that really captures some of the kind of Southeast Alaska native village experience. And I just think that she's a wonderful writer, and would encourage you to read either of those books.
Thank you. Well, you all have a wonderful day and take care. Good to see you all.
Yes, thank you all for coming.